Judge MOCKS black teenager. In court, shocked to learn she's a genius attorney in disguise. What does that little girl think she's doing? That was the question echoing in the minds of many as the doors to courtroom 3 at the Jefferson County Courthouse in Colorado opened at exactly 8:02 a.m. on Monday. In the freezing air of early spring, where the sun had yet to warm the worn marble halls, a young girl stepped inside, alone, silent, but unshaken. Her name was Emily Johnson, 19 years old, from Atlanta, black. A white button-down shirt, gray slacks, and her braided hair neatly tied behind her neck. She had no lawyer by her side. No parents were standing with her. No one older to represent her. But she carried something no one could see from the outside: knowledge, courage, and a very clear plan. The lawsuit she was facing was a seemingly minor civil case when a real estate company attempted to seize her grandmother's home without a final court ruling. But to Emily, it wasn't minor. It was an honor. It was justice. It was a statement to a system that had always looked down on people like her. At the central bench, Judge Charles Garcia, a white man in his 60s with slicked-back salt-and-pepper hair, a deep black robe, and a cold gaze, held the file handed over by the clerk. He glanced down at the legal representation line, then frowned. "Emily Johnson, pro se," he said aloud, making sure the entire courtroom could hear. Emily stood up, calm yet resolute. "Yes, Your Honor. I am the one who filed the opposition, and I choose to represent myself." A moment of silence followed, not out of respect, but out of doubt. Local reporters began scribbling. The defense team, 4 lawyers in expensive suits, whispered among themselves and chuckled. Judge Garcia leaned back in his chair, his gaze laced with that familiar condescension. "You do know this is federal court, right? Not a high school civics class." Emily didn't respond with anger. She simply looked straight at him, her eyes steady and unflinching. "I know," she said, "and I'm ready." They say justice is blind. But in Jefferson that morning, it wasn't blind. It was simply pretending not to see. That is, until Emily Johnson began flipping through page after page of court records and shattered every prejudice in the room with nothing but her intellect and composure. Because some mornings that seem ordinary are where history begins a new chapter. An intense, dramatic story is unfolding. To follow the journey, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our powerful upcoming stories. The courtroom was still packed, but no one stood with Emily. Not because they thought she was wrong, but because they assumed a young black girl standing alone must be naive or foolishly overconfident. Emily took a deep breath, her hands steady, her eyes unwavering. She stepped forward to the podium. Her voice rang out, not too loud, not trying to impress, but clear, every word deliberate. "Your Honor, I would like to represent myself as the legal respondent in this case. I believe I have sufficient legal grounds to oppose the enforcement order requested by the plaintiff." Judge Charles Garcia, renowned for being intolerant of improper conduct in his courtroom, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His gaze swept over Emily, as though he were looking at a high schooler who had wandered into federal court by mistake. "Little girl," he said slowly, with a trace of mockery, "this is federal court, not a high school debate class. I'll give you one chance to withdraw before you embarrass yourself." From the seats below, a soft chuckle escaped. It came from one of the 4 attorneys representing the plaintiff, Wessler and Finch Capital, a real estate company. They wore Hugo Boss suits, Patek Philippe watches, and were chatting as if this were a midday diversion. "This girl won't last 15 minutes, one whispered. "Bet on it," We'll be done before the morning recess." But none of them, not even Judge Garcia, knew the truth. Emily Johnson wasn't just a girl with grit. She was a genius. At age 12, Emily had completed high school at Mapleview High, a small public school in Denver. At 13, she passed the entrance exam for the University of Colorado Boulder, majoring in law, through a special gifted program that only accepted 2 students statewide each year. By 17, she had earned her Bachelor of Laws with a 3.98 GPA, one of the top 3 students in her class. Currently, she worked as a part-time teaching assistant at a civil law research institute. But that detail wasn't in the case file. She didn't need to brag. Because Emily understood. Justice didn't depend on age, skin color, or status. It depended on truth and the ability to lead it. And that morning, beneath countless skeptical stares, she didn't need to shout for attention. She just needed to begin with the opening lines of her opposition brief. "First," Emily said, opening her documents, "with the court's permission, I will present the legal basis for my objection to the plaintiff's enforcement request, pursuant to Section 214B, Article 6 of the Federal Housing and Property Ownership Rights Act." No one was laughing anymore. The plaintiff's lead attorney looked up, frowning. One of his colleagues quickly flipped through his papers. They hadn't prepared for this. Judge Garcia leaned forward. For the first time, he no longer saw her as a little girl, but as a worthy adversary. Because sometimes, prejudice doesn't crumble with a punch, but with an argument so sharp, it silences the room. And Emily had just begun to do that. Not with power, but with intellect. Emily stood tall, her eyes never leaving Judge Charles Garcia's face as she opened her simple canvas bag. Inside was not a phone, nor the kind of scribbled notes people might expect from a young girl representing herself in court. Instead, she pulled out a legal file, 34 pages thick, neatly stapled, printed on high-grade white paper used for official legal documents. She gently placed it on the podium, opened it, and began her presentation. In Section 1, I reference Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 13.6.406, regarding the right to oppose a civil enforcement order in the absence of clear evidence of specific property loss, as affirmed in People v. Elston, 2011, COA 87. Every phrase she used was precise. She didn't rush. She wasn't theatrical. She reasoned, like someone who had lived in law libraries for years, like a professionally trained attorney. Judge Garcia leaned on his elbow, narrowing his eyes. "Where did you get these materials?" he asked, his voice slightly tinged with impatience. Emily didn't smile. She simply answered, "I wrote them." A brief silence fell. From the plaintiff's table came the sound of shuffling papers. The attorneys were scanning Emily's file line by line. One of them, the eldest, likely a senior partner, lifted a copy of her legal citations and whispered. She even referenced the 2022 supplementary ruling. Judge Garcia was clearly shaken, though he tried to maintain a neutral tone. "Do you have any proof that these documents are accurate?" he asked, as if searching for a reason to dismiss what he had just heard. Emily pulled out another sheet, a printout from the University of Colorado Boulder Law Library, including access codes, timestamps, a URL link to the electronic case record, and a comparison section with the original print version she had attached. Pages 17 to 24 are sourced from Westlaw and LexisNexis. The court may verify them at any time. The courtroom buzzed. A journalist from the Denver Tribune in the back row had begun typing. A story was taking shape, and leading it was the young woman they had assumed that morning was just an intern. But what truly turned the tide was the final section of her file. On page 33, Emily cited a ruling from Johnson versus DCS Property Group, in which the court had denied a similar enforcement request on the grounds that the plaintiff had used economic pressure to intimidate minority tenants. She turned to the final page and said calmly, "The plaintiff, Wessler and Finch Capital, was previously investigated for similar practices in Boulder in 2019. I've included the investigation documents in Appendix D." The plaintiff's attorneys went pale. They knew about it, but they hadn't expected this girl to dig it up. Garcia raised a hand to pause. He needed a moment, not to regain control of the courtroom, but to recalibrate his judgment. At that point, Emily quietly reached into her bag and took out another envelope, unopened. On the front, printed in clean, bold letters, Emily Johnson, Bachelor of Laws, University of Colorado Boulder. GPA 3.98, class of 2021. She didn't need to hand it over, because she knew from that moment on, every word in her file was the most powerful proof she could present. And it was also the moment when the court, Judge Garcia, and even the plaintiff's attorneys began to understand. They hadn't just underestimated a young black woman. They had underestimated the law itself, and the true power it holds when it's wielded by someone who knows exactly how to use it. The atmosphere in the Jefferson County courtroom shifted noticeably as Emily Johnson stepped away from the presentation podium and walked toward the rebuttal stand. Her face showed no sign of hesitation. Her eyes were steady. Her every step on the hardwood floor echoed with unwavering rhythm, as if she had walked this space many times before. On the witness stand sat Richard Wexler, CEO of Wessler and Finch Capital, a massive real estate corporation with over 2,000 properties across Colorado. He wore a gray suit, silk tie, and neatly slicked back hair. But as Emily approached, he avoided eye contact. "Good morning, Mr. Wexler," Emily began, her voice calm and clear. "Can you confirm that you signed the eviction notice sent to me on March 12th of this year?" "Yes," Richard replied, lifting his chin slightly. "Are you the direct legal owner of the property at 1127 South Juniper Street?" "I'm the chief executive of the company that owns that property." Emily nodded and pulled out a printed page. "Please read aloud Section 42, Clause 5 of the Colorado State Residential Code." Richard frowned and read slowly. "All eviction notices are valid only if signed by the registered legal owner, excluding agents or representatives, unless accompanied by a specific power of attorney." Emily tilted her head. "And did you provide a valid power of attorney in the file submitted to the court?" I believe the legal department handled that." Emily didn't interrupt, but she pulled out another document and held it up. File number 6-No power of attorney attached. There is no evidence provided that you had the authority to sign on behalf of the legal owner. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The company's attorney, a seasoned man named Carter Hayes with salt and pepper hair, immediately stood up. "Objection. Leading question. Not appropriate for a witness examination." Emily turned to him, unfazed. "Your Honor, this issue is fully outlined in file number 6, line 13. The legal provisions were specifically cited and verified from Colorado state law. The witness has acknowledged signing the document without clear authorization. The question is valid." All eyes turned to Judge Garcia. Until now, he had frequently interrupted her, but this time he only nodded silently. "Proceed." Emily looked back at Richard Wexler, who had begun to sweat. "Are you aware that you are under oath and submitted a document lacking legal authority?" Richard lowered his head. I only signed it at the request of the legal department." Emily took one step forward, the overhead light casting her shadow like a warrior's silhouette. "So, You admit that your action was not based on any specific legal grounds? It might be. Possibly. Emily turned to the jury. No power of attorney, no legal standing. And now, no defense. She then returned to her table and gathered her documents. Judge Garcia looked at Emily, not with sarcasm, but with reluctant recognition. In that moment, no one in the courtroom dared to underestimate the 19-year-old girl again. And that cross-examination, without anger, without shouting, only with reason, evidence, and poise, had dismantled the entire legal shield of a billion-dollar corporation. Within just 30 minutes of the rebuttal beginning, what seemed like a straightforward trial had become the focal point of the entire Jefferson County Courthouse. Emily Johnson, the young woman who had been mocked that morning as a student playing lawyer, was now pushing a $300 million real estate company into complete defensive mode. She didn't use grandstanding or theatrics, just sharp questions, precise legal citations, and a weapon few are prepared to confront: truth, backed by humanity. Emily returned to the defense podium. She pulled out a new stack of documents and handed them to the court clerk. Exhibits. A21 through A31, she said. A compilation of 11 eviction notices, sent around the same time, all lacking legal signatures and addressed to elderly residents of the Jefferson Heights area. She paused, locking eyes with the jury. One of those residents is my grandmother, Mary Johnson, 74 years old. She's lived at 1135 South Juniper Street for 41 years. A few days after receiving her eviction notice, she was hospitalized with severe hypertension and acute psychological distress. Emily opened a medical record, holding it up for Judge Garcia. This is a treatment file from the Denver Medical Center, confirming that her condition was directly related to housing disruption and psychological fear of losing her home. The courtroom fell silent. The atmosphere was no longer a battleground for lawyers or procedural tactics. It had become a moral equation, and Emily was guiding everyone back to the fundamental purpose of the law: protecting people. A female reporter from Denver Legal Watch leaned forward, frantically scribbling notes, while a man in the second row, the company's media liaison, lowered his head, hands trembling. On the defense bench, Carter Hayes now appeared visibly disoriented. He stood and said, "Your Honor, we request a 15-minute recess to review our files." But Judge Garcia, who had previously shown skepticism, shook his head for the first time that day. "Request denied. The rebuttal is proceeding continuously, and there is no basis for delay. Please continue, Ms. Johnson." Emily nodded. She stepped to the projection screen and clicked to a new slide. Percentage of elderly residents affected by unlawful eviction notices in the past 3 months. 73% were people of color with low income. Of those, 9 lived alone, and 3 were undergoing treatment for chronic conditions. The screen displayed data from a local housing advocacy report. This isn't a typical civil case. This is a systemic profit model targeting the most vulnerable. A whisper rose from the back of the courtroom. "Who is she?" No one answered. But everyone knew. Emily Johnson was no longer the young woman representing herself. She was the voice of an entire community, and she was doing what no seasoned attorney had dared: exposing the system in open court. Judge Garcia tapped his fingers on the bench, as if trying to mask something. A flicker of unease had just flashed through his usually cold eyes. And as the morning light streamed through the courthouse's wooden window frames, no one could have guessed that in just 30 minutes, a 19-year-old girl had begun to fracture the power structure that a multi-million-dollar company had spent years constructing. The atmosphere in the Jefferson courtroom, already stretched taut like a wire, seemed to lose all its oxygen when Judge Charles Garcia posed a simple question. "Where did you study law, Emily Johnson?" The question, which might have seemed like a polite bridge between the morning and afternoon sessions, instead sparked the most unexpected turning point of the entire trial. Emily stood upright. Her voice was calm, unassuming. University of Colorado, Your Honor. I graduated valedictorian of the accelerated pre-law program at age 17. I'm currently awaiting licensure from the Colorado Bar Association. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then, like falling dominoes, murmurs rippled through the rows of spectators. A journalist mumbled, "What? Law degree at 17? That's unbelievable." A defense attorney's eyes widened. He blurted out, "She's a real prodigy." As for Garcia, the man who had worn superiority like a robe since morning, leaning on his elbows over the bench, he suddenly straightened. His gaze drifted to the case file he had yet to thoroughly examine. Inside it was a copy of her diploma, bearing the university's seal and a verified signature. But he had overlooked it earlier, because he'd thought, some black kid representing herself probably doesn't have anything worth reading. Now, he couldn't take that glance back. Emily looked directly at him, not with defiance, not with anger, but with a steady gaze that spoke volumes. People should not be judged by their appearance. That statement dropped into the courtroom like a stone into a still pond. Quiet, yet it reached every mind. Then she turned to the jury. "I'm not here today to prove how smart I am. I'm here because 11 families had their housing rights violated. Because a grandmother is in the hospital, afraid of losing her home. My credentials, my age, none of that changes those facts." And in that moment, Emily detached herself from doubt, from every stereotype tied to age, race, or gender. She didn't need the judge to defend her. She wasn't asking for anyone's apology. What she needed, and was demanding, was one thing: true justice. Her academic record and achievements were quickly verified when an online reporter pulled up the University of Colorado student registry. Her name appeared prominently on the Dean's Honor List for 2022. A breaking bulletin for Denver News 7 was hastily drafted and queued. Emily Johnson, the 19-year-old black woman, who stunned a courtroom today by revealing she earned her law degree at 17, is currently successfully defending herself against one of Colorado's largest real estate companies. But while the courtroom reeled from the revelation of her identity, Emily, the very subject of the uproar, quietly stacked her documents, poured a small glass of water, and sat down. The afternoon session unfolded in an eerie silence, not due to a lack of tension, but because everyone seemed to realize they were witnessing something far greater than just a civil case. Just hours earlier, the young black girl had been dismissed as someone playing at law. Now she stood tall in the courtroom, armed with razor-sharp language and irrefutable logic. Judge Charles Garcia, renowned for being immovable, unexpectedly remained silent throughout the first 20 minutes of the session. Each time Emily spoke, he didn't interrupt, didn't frown, didn't mock. On the contrary, he gave a subtle nod when she cited statutes, glanced swiftly at the documents she submitted, and even instructed the clerk to record certain excerpts into the official transcript. No one in the courtroom missed that shift. When Emily presented a motion to dismiss the majority of the damages claims brought by the real estate company, Garcia himself leaned forward to ask, "Could you repeat the legal basis under Section 13-21-103? I'd like to hear your interpretation." Emily showed no hesitation. She replied, "Yes, under Colorado law. Section 13-21-103 clearly states, no real estate entity is permitted to enforce involuntary repossession within 90 days of issuing a contract modification notice unless an emergency exception is approved by the local authority." The answer was concise, respectful, and full of confidence. Garcia slowly nodded. He leaned back in his chair and gently removed his glasses. A quiet moment swept through the room, and then he spoke, not as a judge, but as a man who had just recognized something within himself. I used to think you were arrogant, that you came here to challenge the court, not to seek justice. But today, I was wrong. A soft murmur echoed from the gallery. Emily didn't respond. She merely inclined her head, not as a performance of humility, but as a familiar reflex from someone who had been underestimated her whole life. Garcia continued, this time not just addressing her, but speaking to the entire room. Some trials make us reread the law. Others make us reread ourselves. He turned to the jury and spoke with solemn gravity. The court asks the jury to take note of Ms. Johnson's reasoning and evidence, not only for its legal merit, but also for its civic moral weight. This is not just a land dispute. This is a test of how our system treats those with the least power. The jurors began nodding. One of them, a middle-aged woman in a gray fur coat, quietly dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Outside the courthouse, several reporters had already scribbled down Garcia's words, ready to frame them as tomorrow's headline. Jefferson Court sees a trial that clarified. Not just the law, but the human spirit. The trial wasn't over yet, but for many, the most important verdict had already been delivered. A young woman had entered the courtroom under a cloud of condescension, and now those gazes had changed, not because she shouted, not because she resisted, but because she stood her ground with intellect, logic, and dignity. A single gavel strike echoed, and the entire courtroom seemed to exhale at once, as though they had just witnessed a page of history being written in truth and courage. The courtroom had remained silent for 10 full minutes as everyone awaited the verdict. The ticking of the clock echoed with crisp clarity. Outside, dusk had begun to fall, the amber-red light of sunset streaming through the stained glass windows and casting long shadows on the cold, tiled floor. Emily sat upright, not leaning against the chair. Her eyes did not look toward the ceiling, nor at her opponents, but at her grandmother, sitting in the third row with a proud smile and a hand clutching an old handkerchief. It was for her, and for the other vulnerable residents, that Emily had shown up today. Judge Charles Garcia tapped his gavel lightly against the wood. After thoroughly reviewing the case files, analyzing the arguments and evidence from both parties, he declared firmly, the court rules that the eviction request by Wilson and Pratt is invalid due to violations of direct notification requirements and infringement on the residency rights of the affected households. A few people in the courtroom leaned forward. Emily remained still, as if she had known this outcome all along. Garcia continued. The plaintiff, Wilson and Pratt, is ordered to issue a public apology to all 11 affected households and must pay $48,000 in compensation to support medical, legal, and temporary housing expenses. A ripple of astonishment passed through the room. A few people clapped, hesitantly at first, then more broadly. In the crowd, someone softly murmured, "She actually did it." But the most stunning moment wasn't the ruling. It was what happened next. Judge Garcia slowly rose, removed his glasses, placed them on the bench, and stepped down from his seat. A rare move for a federal judge in the middle of court proceedings. He walked toward Emily, looked at her for a long moment before speaking. In 30 years on this bench, I've read thousands of case files, heard thousands of arguments. But today, you reminded me of something I should never have forgotten. Justice doesn't come from age, gender, or skin color. Justice comes from courage and truth. Emily stood and shook his hand. No tears, no bowing. Just a firm handshake, befitting a lawyer, even if not yet officially licensed. She didn't need to say another word. Behind her, the company's attorneys grabbed their phones and left the courtroom without a glance back. Reporters rushed out, some already making calls as they walked. The story of a young black woman who had taken down a major real estate firm and made an entire legal system reassess itself had officially begun to spread. A female journalist from the Denver Tribune turned to her colleague and said, "No one's going to believe this unless we write it exactly right." 19 years old, and it felt like she was reading the verdict, not defending against it. Remaining in the courtroom, Emily stood beside her grandmother. She placed a hand on the frail shoulders, worn thin by age and stress, and smiled. "Grandma, we won." Not just a courtroom victory, but a triumph of perseverance, a triumph over prejudice, a triumph against the belief that a young black girl could never practice law. And as she stepped out through the doors of Jefferson Court, the evening light fell on her jet-black hair, forming a soft halo, like the very path of justice she had just carved. Less than 24 hours after the groundbreaking trial, a 7-minute video capturing Emily Johnson's courtroom rebuttal was uploaded to Twitter with the headline, "19 years old, no lawyer, yet she made the entire system bow down." The clip spread rapidly, garnering over 3 million views in just 12 hours, with thousands of comments pouring in from around the world. On YouTube, the full trial video, reposted by legal commentary channel Legal Insight, reached 1.2 million views overnight under the title, "Emily Johnson, the legal prodigy who made a judge step down and apologize." The hashtags, "Our teenage attorney" and "Honor Emily Johnson" trended across Twitter in the US, Canada, and the UK Reddit forums buzzed with excitement. She's not just a genius, she's living proof that the system can be changed by the smallest voices. CNN, the Denver Post, and even BBC News ran headlines like, "19-year-old black girl wins landmark case, redefines national perspective on justice." A day later, Emily received over 20 job offers from prestigious law firms such as Scadden, Morrison and Forster, Latham and Watkins, and even a full-ride scholarship offer to Harvard Law School's JD program. Some firms were ready to cover 100% of her tuition, offer $7,000 per month for summer internships, plus travel expenses. However, Emily's response surprised many. In an online interview on the Morning Colorado show, when asked which offer she would accept, Emily replied calmly, "I won't accept any of them. I'm grateful. But my journey doesn't belong in a luxury glass office. I'm going to found a legal organization to help disadvantaged families, the elderly, people of color, those without a voice, so they can finally have the opportunity they deserve." Immediately after her announcement, a community-led GoFundMe campaign raised over $312,000 in 4 days, under the description, "Help Emily Johnson build the first youth-led legal center for the underrepresented." At her old high school, now officially renamed East Jefferson High, Emily's portrait was painted on the library wall beneath the words, "Truth has no age, and justice has no color." The media began referring to Emily as the Rosa Parks of the new legal generation. She received a handwritten letter from Justice Sonia Sotomayor, which read, "Not everyone has the courage to stand, but you stood, and you brought a whole generation to its feet." Yet amid the media frenzy, Emily still showed up to Jefferson's weekly neighborhood council meetings every Tuesday. Still in her simple white shirt, hair neatly tied in a bun, and carrying a laptop in a backpack. No bodyguards, no assistants, no noise. A reporter once asked her, "Don't you feel pressure, knowing the whole country is watching you?" She smiled. "No, I feel hope. And that's exactly why I can't afford to stop." 2 months after that groundbreaking trial, Emily Johnson stood on the main stage of the Redfield High School auditorium, the same place she had quietly walked away from 3 years earlier after a heated debate with the former principal. Back then, she had been labeled a troublemaker for daring to question the school's discriminatory disciplinary policy. But today, she returned, not as a student, but as a symbol. The auditorium was packed. Over 400 high school students from various grades sat in complete silence. Teachers, parents, and even local officials lined the walls. Behind Emily on stage hung a large banner. The power of one voice, Sukman kua mot ngoi dam noi. Emily wasn't wearing a suit, and she had no written speech. She stood simply in a white shirt, wearing her grandmother's old watch, a gift she always wore as a reminder. Her voice rang out strong, not through a microphone, but from a confidence forged through years of being underestimated. When I was 15, I was suspended for talking back to teachers. When I was 16, I finished reading the entire Colorado Civil Code. And at 17, I graduated with a bachelor's in law and a 3.98 GPA, not to prove anything to a committee, but to prove to myself that dreams are real, even when no one else believes in you. A wave of applause filled the room, but Emily didn't stop. Don't let anyone define you by your skin color. Don't let anyone tell you to dream smaller. I heard those words throughout my entire childhood. They said I was too smart to be safe, too outspoken to survive. But knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you. Turn your knowledge into a weapon, and truth into your armor. In the front row, a 9th grade girl named Ayana burst into tears. She clutched her sister's hand and whispered, "I want to study law just like her." Following that talk, Emily was invited to speak at over 18 schools across the state, from Boulder to Fort Collins, from well-funded districts to under-resourced communities. At every stop, she shared a single message. You don't have to wait for someone to give you power. You can create it through knowledge and resolve. Not stopping there, Emily founded a program called Project Ground Up, a nonprofit organization that teaches basic legal literacy to high school students, especially those from minority backgrounds. In its first 6 months, the program attracted over 1,200 students, with more than 40% identifying as Black, Latino, or Indigenous. She worked from a small office funded by a retired judge. The walls were lined with photos of those who had once stood up, from Thurgood Marshall to Michelle Obama, and a whiteboard with a handwritten question. Today, who is someone you want to help understand justice? When asked if she planned to run for office someday, Emily smiled. I'm not even old enough to drink yet. But if there's one thing I hope to achieve, it's this: to turn the law into a tool of hope, not fear. Emily Johnson's story isn't just about a courtroom victory. It's a triumph of intellect, resilience, and unwavering belief. She's not alone. She represents thousands of voices that were once ignored. And now, she stands as a beacon of inspiration for a generation rising to defend justice. What do you think about her resilience? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep discovering powerful stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to Black Strength Stories, where voices and strength never go unnoticed.